The freight horse reared so hard its harness snapped against the wagon, but the enormous cowboy standing in its path never raised a fist or his voice. And Rebecca Turner suddenly wondered why a man Cedar Hollow feared had offered her a marriage with everything except love. "Easy," Luke Dawson murmured, lowering the rope until the terrified gelding chose to stop fighting. Rebecca stepped down into the frozen mud with one suitcase and a marriage agreement waiting to be signed. By sundown, she could become Luke's wife. She would have her own room, her own share of what she earned, and one promise written plainly between them: neither would ask the other for love. Rebecca could live with that. What she had not told Luke was why she had left Missouri, or why one mark she would soon find among his father's old ranch receipts could connect the life she had escaped to the land Luke was about to lose. If you were Rebecca, would you sign that agreement? Stay with her a little longer? The first thing Rebecca Turner saw in Cedar Hollow was a frightened horse. Her wagon had barely stopped beside the freight yard when a gray gelding jerked free of a boy holding its lead. A wooden crate struck the ground. Men shouted. The horse backed toward a loaded wagon, iron shoes slipping over frozen mud. Then a man stepped into its path. Rebecca noticed his size because everyone else did. He stood well over 6 feet, broad through the shoulders, his brown coat stretched across a frame built by years of work. He could have hauled the animal down by the rope. He didn't. He lowered his hand. The gelding snorted. Eyes white. The man waited. Easy, nothing more. His grip loosened whenever the horse stopped pulling. After half a minute, the gelding's head dropped. The man rubbed its neck once and handed the lad back to the boy. A freight driver beside Rebecca followed her gaze. "That's Dawson." Rebecca lifted her suitcase. The driver added, "Big one." She watched the tall man check the horse's mouth for injury before looking toward the arriving wagon. Does he always let frightened things decide when they're ready? The driver had no answer. Luke Dawson did. His eyes had found hers. For a second, neither moved. Then Luke crossed the yard and removed his hat. "Miss Turner, Rebecca, Luke Dawson," I had gathered. Something almost became a smile beneath his mustache. Almost. They were married that afternoon in a small office near the general store, with Sheriff Isaac Dunn and Edith Lawson serving as witnesses. Before Rebecca signed, Luke placed another sheet beside the marriage record. It was the agreement they had discussed in their letters. Egg money she helped earn would partly belong to her. So would proceeds from garden produce, lodging, and horses boarded through work she performed. She would have her own room and control of her personal money. Luke tapped the bottom of the page. "There's one thing I want clear before you sign." Rebecca waited. "I promised you a lawful marriage, a decent roof, your fair share." He looked directly at her. "I didn't promise love. I won't ask it from you either." Edith suddenly became very interested in rearranging papers. Rebecca read the agreement once more. Then she signed. "Good." Luke's brow shifted. She capped the pen. "I didn't travel to Colorado looking for a man to carry me, Mr. Dawson. I came because your letter was the only one that told me what a wife would own, instead of only what she would owe." Luke stared at her. Rebecca handed him the pen. "Your turn." By dusk, they were riding south along Cottonwood Freight Road. The Sangre de Cristo peaks stood dark beyond the valley, their upper slopes already holding snow. Wagon ruts had hardened beneath a skin of ice. Cottonwoods along Cedar Creek had lost nearly every leaf. Dawson Ranch appeared beyond a weathered gate. It was no grand spread. A low house stood near the barn. Hay was stacked beneath canvas. Beyond the corrals, Blue Rock Spring ran clear through yellow grass before joining the creek. Inside, Rebecca found a kitchen scrubbed clean enough to smell of lye soap. Luke showed her the stove, pantry, washstand, then opened a door at the end of the hall. Her room. The bed had been repaired with fresh pine along one rail. A small writing table stood beneath the window. The wall hooks had been fixed at a height she could reach without stretching. Luke remained outside the doorway. If something's missing, tell me. Rebecca touched the door. There was a lock on her side. She looked back. Luke had already stepped away. My room's at the other end, he said. Breakfast before daylight. That was all, yet Rebecca stood with her hand on the little brass latch long after his footsteps disappeared. The man who had promised her no tenderness had spent weeks making certain she would never have to wonder whether she could lock him out. The days that followed settled into work. Luke spoke easily to horses and poorly to people. Rebecca discovered he could identify a lame animal from 20 yards away, but had receipts stuffed into 3 different drawers. By the 4th evening, she had begun keeping expenses herself. Flour, oats, lamp oil, salt, feed, 2 payments against the ranch note. She added the figures again, then once more. Something was wrong. Dawson Ranch brought in little, but it brought in enough. Luke also insisted his father had paid heavily against the mortgage before his death. The balance in the papers did not show it. Rebecca said nothing, not yet. A week later, while searching for an older feed receipt, she found a narrow wooden box behind a stack of cattle tallies. Inside were papers in Luke's father's handwriting. Rebecca carried them to the table. The first receipt was ordinary. The second made her stop. Beside the payment amount sat a small handwritten mark, 2 short strokes crossed by a third. Rebecca knew that mark. She had seen it hundreds of miles east, in the freight and credit office in Missouri. Her fingers went cold. She pulled another receipt. The same mark, a third. Again. A boot struck the porch outside. Rebecca closed the box. Luke's heavy steps crossed toward the door. She sat perfectly still, one palm resting on the lid. She was not afraid he would find her looking through his father's accounts. She was afraid of what those accounts had just told her. Rebecca Turner had crossed hundreds of miles to leave Missouri behind. But somehow, before she had ever seen Cedar Hollow, a piece of Missouri had already found Luke Dawson. She kept that thought to herself. For the next 2 weeks, Cedar Hollow moved steadily toward winter. Frost stayed longer beneath the cottonwoods. Snow appeared white along the western ridge each morning, and wagons on Cottonwood Freight Road began carrying more flour, salt, coal oil, and baled feed before the passes turned bad. Rebecca found work everywhere. She also found waste. One evening she placed a sheet of figures beside Luke's coffee. "We have room for 4 more horses." Luke looked from the paper to her. "Barn doesn't, not yet. That sounds expensive." Rebecca took his pencil and tapped 3 numbers. Freight riders needed remount boarding through winter. 4 horses a month would cover flour, salt, lamp oil, and part of their feed. Luke studied the figures without speaking. Rebecca gathered the cups. She did not argue. The next morning, hammer blows woke her before sunrise. Luke was building 2 new stalls. That became their way. He showed her how snow gathered differently before a north wind, how a horse favoring one foreleg might be hiding a stone in its hoof. Which stretch of Cedar Creek iced first? She showed him why the interest written on one mortgage statement did not agree with the previous month's balance. Luke frowned at the page. "I'd rather shoe a mule. Mules don't charge interest. That's why I trust them." Rebecca laughed before she could stop herself. Luke looked up. For once, he did not look away first. Small things changed around the house. A chair Rebecca found too high disappeared into the shed and returned with its legs shortened. A tear in Luke's work glove vanished beneath dark thread after Rebecca found it beside the stove. Some evenings supper ended, but neither rose from the table, Samuel Pike noticed. The blacksmith came by one cold afternoon to reset a wagon rim and stood watching Luke finish the new stalls. "For a Loveless marriage," Samuel said. "Place is getting mighty lively." Luke gave him a long look. Samuel cleared his throat. "I'll tend to my iron." Rebecca hid her smile. Later, Samuel told her something else. 3 years earlier, a stable foreman had been striking a young helper with the metal end of a buckle. Luke stepped between them. The foreman swung at Luke. Luke hit him once. One blow put the man on the ground. "And Luke stopped," Samuel said. "That's the part folks leave out." Rebecca remembered the gray gelding at the freight yard, the open hand, the waiting. She understood a little more. Then, in early November, Cedar Creek nearly took that quiet life away. A feed wagon was coming down the grade toward the wooden bridge when its brake pins slipped loose. The wagon rolled hard. The team panicked. Luke ran for the horses, cutting one trace free before the wagon slewed sideways. A timber load shifted with a cracking sound. "Rebecca, back!" She saw Luke disappear behind the wagon. When the dust settled, one beam had pinned his right ankle against the frozen bank. Rebecca ran to him. "Don't lift it," Luke said through his teeth. "It'll roll, I know." She looked at the slope, the wagon, the draft mare trembling 20 feet away. Then she moved. Rebecca freed the mare from the damaged rig, brought her around uphill, and ran a chain from the wagon box around the fallen timber. Luke watched her knot the connection. "Where'd you learn that?" "My father worked a wagon yard." She took up the mare's lead. "Save your questions." The horse leaned into the harness. The chain tightened. The timber shifted inches. "Enough." Luke pulled his boot free and rolled clear. When he tried to stand, his leg folded beneath him. Rebecca caught his arm. For once, big Luke Dawson had no choice but to put some of his weight on another person. He resisted for half the walk home, then stopped pretending. That evening his ankle was swollen badly, but moved without the sharp signs of a break. Rebecca wrapped it with clean cloth and set a cold compress over the swelling. Luke watched her hands. "Were you afraid?" Rebecca tied the bandage. "Of the wagon." She looked up. "Not of you." Luke's eyes stayed on hers for a moment. Then he turned toward the dark window. 2 nights later, Rebecca brought the old receipts to the kitchen table. The lamp flame moved between them. "I kept books in Missouri," she said. Luke waited. "I found payments going into accounts where they didn't belong. When I asked questions, they said I'd changed the books myself." His jaw tightened. "They accused me of taking money." Luke asked only one thing. "Did you take it?" "No." He closed the ledger. "Then I'll start from there." Rebecca's fingers remained around her coffee cup. Luke did not ask her to prove herself. He did not ask why she had waited. Not that night. After he went to his room, Rebecca sat alone until the stove burned low. Then she opened her suitcase. Beneath 2 folded dresses lay a small notebook wrapped in plain cloth. She turned through pages of dates, amounts, initials, and transaction marks copied before she left Missouri. There. The same crossed mark she had found on Luke's father's receipts. Rebecca moved the lamp closer. Beside it was a company name she had hoped never to see again. Crane and Holt Credit Company. She read it twice, then looked toward the hallway where Luke slept. The company now holding the mortgage on Dawson Ranch belonged to Walter Crane. Rebecca did not sleep much that night. Before breakfast, she set the little notebook beside Luke's coffee. He looked at it, then at her. "There's more." Luke said nothing. Rebecca folded her hands. "I copied those entries before I left Missouri. I didn't take the company's ledger. I didn't take money. But I knew something was wrong. And I was afraid if I walked out with nothing, they'd make sure no one ever believed me." Luke's face did not harden. That was worse. He picked up the notebook, turned a few pages, then set it down. "You knew this could follow you." "Yes, and you married me anyway." Rebecca swallowed. "I thought I had left it behind." Luke rose. He carried his coffee outside without another word. For nearly an hour, Rebecca heard hammer blows from the barn. When she finally looked through the window, Luke was working on the same hinge over and over. It had been straight before sunrise. She did not go after him. The next morning, the notebook sat beside his plate. Rebecca pushed it toward him. "Read it or burn it, but don't pretend I never brought it." Luke opened it. Halfway through, he stopped. "This date, Rebecca leaned closer. Luke pointed to a line from 3 winters earlier. My father rode 30 miles through snow to make that payment. I remember because he came home after midnight with ice on his coat. Rebecca pulled the old cattle tally from the shelf. Near the same date, in faded pencil, were 4 words, paid by wire confirmation. Luke read them twice. Where's the confirmation? It isn't here. By noon, they were riding toward town. Edith Lawson kept the general store warm with a cast-iron stove that smelled faintly of coffee, leather, and dried apples. Behind the counter stood a narrow cabinet where telegraph copies and freight notices were sometimes stored for ranchers living too far out to collect them quickly. Edith listened while Rebecca gave her the date. That's old, I know. Oh, you may be lucky. They were not lucky enough. The original confirmation was gone, but in a worn message book, Edith found a notation. Payment received by wire. Receipt forwarded to Dry Cedar Station. Luke rested both hands on the counter, so the money was received. Looks that way, Edith said. Rebecca stared at the line. Dry Cedar Station. Another trail. On the ride home, the sky had turned the color of old tin. Snow threatened over the ridge. Luke finally spoke. When you saw Crane's name, why didn't you leave? Rebecca kept her eyes on the road. Because I'm tired. Luke glanced over. Of what? Of letting dishonest men decide where I'm allowed to live. The horses walked another 100 yards before either spoke. That evening they worked at the kitchen table beneath one lamp, receipts on one side, Rebecca's notebook on the other. Luke's father's cattle tally between them. At some point, Rebecca laid her head against one hand and closed her eyes. When she woke, Luke was standing behind her. His coat settled across her shoulders. He started to step away. Rebecca caught his wrist. Luke froze. Don't keep stepping away because you promised not to love me. The room went very still. Luke looked down at her hand around his wrist, then at her face. You sure that's what I'm doing? Rebecca released him slowly. No. Luke could have left it there. He didn't. He bent, careful as if approaching a skittish horse, and kissed her once. Slowly, when he pulled back, Rebecca remained close enough to feel his breath. Neither smiled. Neither needed to. For the first time, the agreement between them felt like something written for 2 other people. The knock came the next morning, 3 hard taps. Luke opened the door. A man stood on the porch in a clean dark coat, his boots too polished for Cottonwood Freight Road. He removed one glove. Walter Crane. Rebecca went cold. Crane's gaze moved past Luke and settled on her. So you did come west. Luke stepped into the doorway. What do you want? Crane reached into it and produced a folded paper. Business. He laid it on the kitchen table. The notice bore the county seal. 30 days before proceedings on the Dawson mortgage. Luke read it once, then again. Crane spoke calmly. Blue Rock Spring will satisfy most of what is owed. Sign over the water right, and I can be reasonable about the rest. Rebecca looked at him. Prejean looked back. Then his eyes dropped to the small notebook near her elbow. Your wife, he said, left Missouri with property that wasn't hers. Luke did not look at Rebecca. He kept looking at Crane. And in that moment, something settled into place. Rebecca had not brought danger to Dawson Ranch. The danger had been there before she arrived. She was simply the first person who knew how to read its name. After Crane left, winter seemed to arrive all at once. 2 freight riders who had planned to board remount horses at Dawson Ranch changed their minds. Edith Lawson stopped extending store credit because, as she put it, papers make people nervous. Hay prices rose after the first hard freeze. Rebecca did not complain. She sat at the kitchen table with a pencil, trimmed flour from one column, lamp oil from another, and crossed out the money she had set aside for a winter dress. Luke saw the mark. He said nothing. 2 mornings later, a bolt of plain brown wool sat on her chair. Rebecca found the empty peg in the tack room, where Luke's father's old saddle had always hung. She understood. Neither mentioned it. The next week, Walter Crane caught Luke outside Samuel Pike's blacksmith shop. Snowmelt dripped from the eaves, horses steamed in the cold. Crane spoke quietly. "One spring, one signature. Your wife never hears another word from Missouri." Luke's face stayed still, and the other ranches? Crane did not answer. That silence told Luke more than any paper had. Rebecca heard enough from inside the shop. That night she packed her suitcase, the same one she had carried into Cedar Hollow. Luke found it on the bed. He did not touch it. Instead, he went to the kitchen, returned with the marriage agreement, and laid it beside the suitcase. Rebecca looked at him. "Your father left you this land." Luke nodded. "He left me a name too." She said nothing. Luke rested one hand on the agreement. "This paper gave you the right to stay because you chose to. It doesn't give me the right to keep you," his voice lowered. "But don't decide what I'm willing to lose without asking me." Rebecca looked down at the suitcase. "I won't be the reason you lose this place. I'm not keeping one thing by ruining another." The next day, Crane made his second mistake. He chose the general store. It was crowded. Samuel stood near the stove. Sheriff Dunn was at the doorway. Edith was weighing coffee beans behind the counter. Crane looked at Rebecca and said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "Seems Mrs. Dawson has always known how to make a man carry her trouble." Luke moved before anyone else did. One step, then another. Chairs scraped against the floor. Samuel stopped breathing through his pipe. Crane almost smiled. Rebecca said only one word. "Luke." He stopped. His right hand was closed. Slowly he opened it. Then he placed 2 coins on the counter for the nails he had come to buy. "You came here hoping I'd make your story true." Luke turned his back on Crane. No one followed him. No one laughed. By evening, Cedar Hollow was telling a different story about Big Luke Dawson. Rebecca spent the next 2 days chasing another one. The missing wire confirmation had been sent to Dry Cedar Station. The man who had managed that station was dead. His widow, Abigail Moore, still lived near Dry Cedar Crossing. Luke and Rebecca rode there before the next snow. Abigail's cabin leaned into the wind beside an abandoned wagon shed. She remembered Luke's father, but not the account. "I kept old papers," she said. "Couldn't stand throwing away good paper." They searched until dusk. Receipts had been used beneath shelf jars, folded into boxes, even written over with household notes. Rebecca found the first one behind a stack of flour tins. The amount matched, the date matched, the agent's stamp matched. So did the reference number. 4 to Crane's predecessor. Luke looked at her. Rebecca kept searching. Then she found another receipt. Different ranch, same pattern. Then a third, then a fourth. Rebecca sat back on her heels. This isn't one bad account. Luke understood. It's a system. They returned after dark. The barn door stood open. Luke dismounted first. Nothing had been stolen. Not the horses, not the cash tin, not the harness. The small desk near the tack wall had been forced open. Rebecca looked at the empty drawer. Luke looked at her. Slowly, she reached into the lining of her coat. The notebook appeared in her hand. "I never left it there." Luke let out one breath. For the first time, they had enough to fight back. And for the first time, Walter Crane knew they had it. The mortgage review was set for 3 days later at the county hall. By then, word had spread farther than Rebecca expected. Men came in from ranches along Cottonwood Freight Road carrying old envelopes, folded receipts, payment stubs, and notebooks darkened by years of dust. Some had once avoided looking at her in the general store. Now they waited outside the hall with papers in their hands. Rebecca noticed. She said nothing. Inside, Luke stood near the back wall, not beside her. Not because he was distant, because this part belonged to her. Sheriff Dunn sat near the front. Edith Lawson had brought the old telegraph notation. Abigail Moore arrived wrapped in a heavy gray shawl, with the freight receipts tied in ribbon. Walter Crane entered last. His coat was clean, his expression was not. Rebecca placed the papers on the long table. She began with Luke's father's cattle tally. This date shows a payment sent. She placed Edith's notation beside it. This confirms the wire was received. Then Abigail's freight receipt. This shows the same amount, the same date, the same reference number, and the forwarding mark. Finally, Rebecca opened her notebook. This is how the payment appeared after it reached the credit office. The balance had not gone down. The room stayed quiet. Crane leaned back. Old bookkeeping errors. Rebecca placed a second ranch receipt on the table, then another, then a third. Same error? No one laughed. A rancher near the window stepped closer. He picked up one of the papers and stared at the signature. That's my father's. Another man moved forward. Then another. Crane's calm began to crack. Rebecca looked at him. I don't need you to explain me, Mr. Crane. Explain the numbers. He tried. The dates did not help him, neither did the mortgage assignments. And there, hidden in the sequence Rebecca had once misunderstood, was the last piece. Her former employer in Missouri had begun diverting payments before Crane acquired the accounts. But Crane's company had purchased those accounts after the missing payments were already visible in the records. He had seen the pattern, he had known, and instead of correcting it, he had continued using the false balances to pressure ranchers into surrendering land and water access. Sheriff Dunn read the assignment date twice, then looked at Crane. You bought these knowing the books didn't match. Crane's face tightened. Rebecca closed her notebook. For years, men had spoken about her as if character could be settled by rumor. Now she stood in a room where the arithmetic was doing the talking. Crane reached across the table. Fast, his hand struck Rebecca's shoulder as he lunged for the notebook. Luke moved, one hand closed around Crane's wrist. Nothing else, the hall went still. Everyone knew the old story about Big Luke Dawson. Everyone knew what they expected next. Luke looked at Crane, then at Rebecca. His grip loosened. Took the notebook from Crane's hand and released him. Now it's your work, Luke said to Sheriff Dunn. That was all. No blow, no threat. Sheriff Dunn stepped forward. By sunset, the foreclosure on Dawson Ranch had been halted pending review. Other claims tied to Crane's company were ordered examined. The matter would go farther than Cedar Hollow now. Rebecca walked out of the county hall carrying her notebook under one arm. A rancher she barely knew stopped her on the steps. My wife kept every receipt since '84, he said. Could you look at them? Rebecca glanced at Luke. He gave the smallest nod. She turned back. Bring them Monday. By early March, the snow line had pulled halfway up the ridge. Blue Rock Spring ran dark and clear beneath thinning ice. One morning, Rebecca came from the barn and found Luke at the ranch gate with a hammer in his hand. A new sign hung between two fresh posts. Dawson and Turner stock, remounts. Freight water. Rebecca stood beneath it. Turner? Luke drove the last nail. Your name earned its place before mine did. She looked at him. We agreed on a marriage without love. Luke reached into his coat and touched the folded agreement still kept there. That was the only bargain I couldn't keep. The wind moved through the bare cottonwoods. Luke set the hammer down. If there'd been no ranch, no debt, no agreement, would you still choose me? Rebecca said nothing. She pulled off her glove. Then she slipped the wedding ring from her finger. Luke did not move. For one brief second, something in his face went empty. Rebecca placed the ring in his palm. Ask me again. Luke looked down at it, then back at her. This time there was no contract between them. No debt. No promise of shelter. No bargain. Only choice. Rebecca Turner. Will you marry me? Her mouth softened. Yes. Luke slid the ring back onto her finger. Behind them, horses shifted in the barn. Water moved beneath the last skin of ice at Blue Rock Spring. The new sign creaked once in the March wind. Luke had once believed the safest way not to lose something was never to love it. Rebecca had taught him better. A home was not made by holding land. It was made when two people knew exactly what choosing each other might cost, and chose each other anyway. And maybe that was the real lesson Cedar Hollow left behind. Luke Dawson had spent years believing strength meant carrying every burden alone. Rebecca Turner had learned something just as painful. That when other people tried to stain your name, sometimes the easiest thing was to keep moving until nobody knew your past. But neither of them found peace by running from what frightened them. Luke stayed when loving Rebecca threatened the land his father had left him. Rebecca stayed when the same kind of dishonesty that had driven her from Missouri appeared at her new doorstep. And when the moment came to choose between fear and trust, neither asked the other to become smaller. They simply stood together. Perhaps that is what a second chance really looks like. Not forgetting what happened. Not pretending the hurt never mattered. Just finding someone who knows the truth of you and still leaves the choice in your hands. So if you had been standing at that ranch gate with Luke and Rebecca, knowing what choosing each other might cost, would you have stayed? Tell me in the comments. I'd truly like to know. And if stories about wounded hearts, quiet courage, hidden truths, and love found beneath the wide western sky mean something to you, subscribe and ride with us a little farther. There are still many trails ahead, and somewhere beyond the next ridge, another story is waiting to be told.